This video is sponsored by Shortform. More on them later. If you're the person that reads and reads and reads for hours but never ends up remembering anything, it's because you don't do the incredibly important steps that you need to be doing during the study sessions to memorize effectively. My name is Zain Asif, I'm a third year medical student, and in this full guide we are going through the exact steps one by one. Every single specific scientifically backed action that you need to be taking in order to not only understand information but to memorize it and ingrain it in your head in a way that revolutionizes the way you learn. These last few weeks, I've gone through 6 different scientifically backed memory books. I've explored the nuances of exactly how our brain memorizes information. I've experimented with these techniques for my own studies in medical school and condensed it all into a digestible, easy to follow method for all of you. But here's the catch. As always, this isn't like any other video because this is an active guide filled with practical steps of things that you can do right now to improve your memory skills and to actually memorize the topic with me in real time. And I know most videos just show you a list of unrelated words and then show you pictures in order to memorize them. But what's the point in doing that? It's completely different from the content and the information that we actually have to memorize for our exams. So pick an actual topic that you are studying, a complex process, and multiple equations, and follow along the steps in this video to perfectly memorize it. This detailed guide is going to be broken up into 3 parts. 1. Associating the information, 2. Visualizing the information, and 3. Recalling the information. Part 1. Associating the information. This first entire part is always invisible to the normal person. Not a lot of people do it, not a lot of people realize that I do it, and when people catch me memorizing stuff like this in the next sections, they all say, oh my god, how are you so fast at learning? How do you remember so much? When it's not really the same thing if you haven't done the first main big step. So let's get into it. We all think that if I understand a topic well enough, that'll just magnetically stick in my head. But the funny fact is the way that our brain and our memory works that we're literally trying to discard and forget as much as possible in any given moment. And yes, if you read and understand a topic, it does create a good base, but to actually memorize information, to make your brain think that this is worth keeping, you need to be able to create number 1, relation, and number 2, value. Relation means that you need to associate the new information you're learning to your prior knowledge, to create connections between this information and your strong basic foundation. And then creating value means to show your brain that this information is relevant and important. You're literally screaming at it, please don't throw it away, it is worth keeping. And both of these, relation and value, can both be created through very practical techniques. And that's what we'll achieve with these next steps. Step number 1, map the entire topic. The only way we can create relevance to the information we want to learn is by first mapping out the entire topic. This means sitting down and creating a foundation, a mental model of all the basics, separating the logical backbone of the chapter from the fluff. Both Barbara Oakley and Olaf Schu, i.e. big neuroscientists in the space, they say in multiple books that most students, while reading information, actually choke up their working memory, or in other words, overloaded with information too quickly, giving no actual attention to the individual pieces of information, which means very little connects from their working memory to their long-term memory. And the solution that they always mentioned was to make time before you start learning to simplify the concepts to the absolute basics, the applicable rules, the key big overarching themes and topics that sometimes people even ignore because they're too simple. And the reason we do this is because it'll become much easier to embed the details into our memory if we can relate them back to this foundational web of basics that we're creating while we do this mapping step. And the practical steps to do this initial mapping is to step 1, skim the entire chapter starting with the absolute basics. This means looking at the main headings, the definitions, the keywords, simplifying them and trying to vaguely understand every big point being discussed, but no memorizing. You're just going through the book and kind of marinating your brain. Becoming familiar with the content. This step usually takes me around 20 to 30 minutes per big topic, but it usually depends on the content. An added tip here is to not think too much about how everything is structured just yet. So don't focus on, oh, this is the title, this is the subtitle, this is the main heading. The way we think about and structure information while we take it in is highly important in the long term to how we remember it. So leave the structure until you've skimmed through and have a basic understanding of all the topics. Skimming through information, however, is quite tough when you have 800-page books and multiple books on the same topic and you don't know which to actually spend time reading. But don't worry, because the sponsor of today's video, Shortform, has got us covered. They are the very first sponsors I've ever accepted, and it's because their book summaries and their guides are exactly what I use before I read most books. In fact, it's what I use for all of the research I did for this video as well. Instead of spending hours reading through all these big name memory learning books, searching for things that would would only be applicable to us students, I simply went through their one-page summaries and searched for the specific things in the books that were actually useful. And the reason they're so good is because they're not like most summaries, they're like full guides. The guy who writes them compares the key ideas of these books with other books, with other prominent research, with conflicting theories. So the gist is, it gives you all the information you need. And short form has thousands of books on learning, personal development, finance, business, and a lot of other genres. And if you want a book that they don't have yet, then you can actually vote for books, and they upload new books every week as well. So if you're interested, click on the link in my description, shortform.com/Zain. That's all it is, shortform.com/ZAIN. Zain, my first name. You get 5 days of unlimited free access and then another 20% off the annual subscription as well. And if you use the specific link, I get a little bit of kickback as well, which really helps support this channel. So thank you for listening. Let's get back to the mapping method. The second step of this method is to think about how all of these big ideas that you've read about and understood the basics about can be now categorized and chunked together. How can these big ideas be put into categories and subcategories, and how can they all be linked together? Don't look at your textbook for this. Think in your own head. What is the main trunk of that tree? What is the main topic? What are the main big branches coming off? What are the subtopics, and what are the small leaves that you want to attach at the end? In my previous full study guide, I know I did say to write out everything, all the keywords and topics onto one big list and put everything on there. But to start studying a topic, well, when doing that, when you have zero basic understanding, is quite annoying and difficult to do with a lot of topics. And what I've actually found useful is to start with doing that basic overview and then come up with my own well thought out structure of all the topics and make that mind map. I think doing it that way makes the topic stick out more in your memory. And it's because once you have a decent basic understanding, you can link it all faster and start to create relationships right off the bat. And just skip that extremely nonsense mind map that you'd be making with absolutely zero knowledge, which then just gives you more time to strengthen everything overall in the process. Step number 3 is to actually now create that initial mind map. This is what this initial mapping method is all about. You have the basics, you can simply kind of define most aspects and processes of the topic now, and you've created a general idea of how to link the subtopics and topics together. So now put all the main concepts on paper, use your previous knowledge, and read around the topic to then create relationships between everything. Helpful questions to think about when structuring and creating those connections between different topics and subtopics. You can ask yourself, how do these main topics fit together if they were puzzle pieces? How are they related to each other? Can I compare them? Are there similarities, differences? Are these cause and effect? Are these smaller parts of a bigger whole? I've talked about this method before, and I know that this mapping priming stage in the start seems extra, but overall everything takes around 45 minutes. And now you've not only gone through all the topic's basics, but you've also created a full structured mind map or mental model of the topic that you can now build upon. Most people wouldn't be able to do this even if they had hours with the normal study method. Like, you don't understand how much easier the entire memorization process is after doing this step. When you now read the textbook and watch lectures, you're automatically linking and anchoring this information to your previous knowledge. And this previous knowledge is that well thought out mind map with all the basics of the topic. And this is a summary slide for the initial mapping method. Quick pause in the video, guys. These guides honestly take so long to make and structure and plan out and research for, but I do them because I know it helps people so much. It helps me as well, to be honest. But please, could you click off the video, leave a like, spam comments, help me out with the algorithm. Click on that short form link, you get a 5-day free trial, and then you get an annual 20% off the annual subscription. Anyways, thank you. Let's get right back in the guide. Step 2, Intrigue creates value. Now, obviously, as you continue to read, you will be building upon that initial structure of the topic, correcting it, seeing what your gaps are. But instead of aimlessly reading through the chapters like everyone else, because you did that initial mapping, you will be skipping around and jumping to the subtopics that you actually want to learn more about. And that's because you already have the basics. So once you have those basics, you will want to think how this works and how this connects to this, and you'll want to jump to certain specific subtopics. You'll be forming the interest through your own learning. This saves a ton of time and it adds that interest-based exploration. And that is immediately what gives this topic value. Because once something becomes interesting, it becomes important in our brain and it's much more likely to stick. Oakley's model, Badley and Hitch's working model of memory all tell us that our attentional control system is actually responsible for transferring our knowledge from our working memory to then our long-term memory. I.e., the more attention and emotions that you give to the new information that you're learning, the stronger the connections will become between this new information and the previous information that you have. Number 1, studying deeply. And to be honest, the best way to give this information more attention is to create intrigue, to have aha moments, to understand the information as deeply as possible, to understand it from first principles. This means you can't just be normally reading through and just accepting things as facts. It means assessing your understanding of the information as you go through it. For example, if you read about anticoagulants, don't just accept what it is and how it works and then read about the examples. Think deeper. How does this DOAC help stop the clotting? What does it specifically work on? Instead of just accepting the facts as it is, you think deeper about the information, ask yourself questions, and that'll allow you to remember more anyways. It's basic, but this is the sort of stuff, thinking this way when I'm studying is the reason I remembered most of my studying before I discovered all these great techniques. I always asked why, to the point that where I was being annoying. I never took things at face value, and I always informally kind of tested myself on what I was learning. That's how you'll actually remember more, when you can talk about things from first principles, talk exactly about why this happens and what causes this to happen. The one caveat here is to know the limits to being super curious. There's a lot of content to get through, and if you become curious about everything, then you'll never end up actually covering it. So learn to become satisfied with a good level of understanding. I think a good limit to have is if you can teach it to someone, that is enough. Number 2, studying broader. Your brain mainly remembers things that are different. So if you just read about yet another disease and then just move on, you won't remember much, obviously. But if you can assign meaning to it, if you can say why something is relevant, that is when your brain goes like, oh wait, hold on, hey, this is important, pay attention. So as you read through the information, focus on thinking about 1, why something is important to you, and number 2, why this information is important for the real world. For number 1, you think selfishly, why do I need to know this information? For which section of which topic? How does this fit in with my own mental structure of what I'm learning? And then for number 2, think with an open heart. Where else in the world does this matter? Who does it matter to? Imagine the patient with the disease. Think about why what you're learning is important. That's the key takeaway. This second step was the easy, non-complicated ways of actually making the things that you're learning more memorable. The first bit of this is number 1, studying from first principles, i.e. consistently asking why. And then number 2, studying with the broader context, i.e. consistently asking why is this important. Step 3 is to create a memorization filter. After building the basics, creating a good mental model, and then while you're reading, also creating intrigue and then making the content relevant, there is one last very important and kind of obvious thing that you need to be doing before you start to memorize everything from your textbooks. You need to differentiate between the content that needs to be understood versus the content that needs to be understood as well as memorized. The things that you can only remember by memorizing them, and it doesn't really work with just understanding them. The fact is that memorization techniques need to be the last resort. Being in med school where there's a whole lot of information to actually go through and study, we've now created a good mental barrier for the things that can be directly, intuitively understood versus the things that need to be just rote memorized. The reason I'm putting so much emphasis on this is because understanding the concept is the best way to memorize it and then remember it long term. If you can understand why something happens and work through the logic, even if you don't know all the details, you can still look at the exam question and work through the concept one by one, work through the logic and get to some sort of an estimated answer. If you can logically understand something, you win. Logic is king. If I smash my laptop with a hammer, I know it will break. That is logic. I don't need a memory palace to remember that. And because most of us don't want to spend useless time memorizing things that we can just intuitively understand, that's why we use this filter to filter out the information that actually needs to be fully memorized. Me putting effort into the memorizing equals to long processes plus difficult and sporadic details plus extremely niche diseases. Those are the 3 main types of information that I'm aiming to memorize. Make your own filter for the information depending on the degree and what you study. It's important so that you don't just waste time stupidly using brain power on active memorizing techniques when you can simply do your recall questions and attain deeper understanding. Also note that around 80 to 90% of that information does not fall in this filter for memorization, but for the specific lengthy processes with a million steps and so many byproducts and the illogical, sporadic, niche information, this is what I suggest doing to memorize them. Part 2. Visualizing the information. See, the point of memorizing here is to transform the information that you're studying into a format that the brain will quickly understand and absorb, i.e., images and places. Because we are incredible at forgetting words instantly, whereas we are profoundly good at keeping mental images. If you close your eyes and think of the best vacations, the best food, the best people that you've ever met, you need visual images to recall those detailed faces and places. So after a lot of research and using my own experiences over the years, I've modified a mix of techniques and strategies that a lot of memory books and scientists swear by, but I've made it applicable to the type of content that us students have to learn, which isn't usually all the digits of pi or a random list of objects that most of these books are teaching us to memorize. So this visualization method isn't just to visualize the information, it is the way that you will ingrain it all in your mind. Keep in mind that all the steps within the first part of this guide, associating the information, all need to be completed for this to work as well as it can. Step 1, creating the crazy story. The very first step is to visualize like a crazy man, and then create a story. Now this is difficult to explain, so listen carefully, replay bits if you need. Our brain loves the absurd. So when studying a step-by-step process, for example, replace all the words that you need to memorize with visual graphic images. It's obviously easy to do with organs like the heart or the gallbladder and imagine all the complex processes happening within them. But something like a glioblastoma, that is very hard to picture. So in my mind, it becomes the goblin from Harry Potter, or potassium, that element, you can't really think of that, so that becomes bananas. I don't know why it's bananas, that's just how it is in my head. You get the gist. And so for a step-by-step process, I will imagine a story unfold in my head, with each element, each step happening in 3D, but exaggerated. Remember, the story has to be absurd because our brains will only remember it if it's different and weird. I knew about this before. I do this a lot with my learning anyways, and I know a lot of us probably do. But what I didn't realize or didn't think about was the fact that you can do this visualizing method with any information, with tables filled with difficult information, with rare diseases that are difficult to imagine, with all the mnemonics that you have to learn. You can visualize and create a crazy story about anything that you need to memorize. For example, let me show you how you can use it to memorize a huge table of brain cancers with all of their characteristics, cell types, etc. Very high yield technique for exams, by the way, because with big tables, you're usually given them because the exam questions are going to ask you to differentiate between the different things in that table. If you're trying to remember the histopathological findings, the cell types, the tests for all of these cancers, the best solution is to chunk all of these cancers together into one story. If you have like 10-20 cancers to memorize, each with different tests, mnemonics, cell types, it's very, very easy to let one or two of them slip or to confuse one or two of them. But if you have them linked through a story, it's much more logical and you're way less likely to actually forget anything. So for the brain cancers, the goblin from Harry Potter, i.e. for the glioblastoma, breaks through a big brick wall because that tumor actually crosses the midline in a CT scan, and there's a butterfly on top of that wall because the tumor is usually shaped like a butterfly classically. And then continuing with the story, the other side of the wall is a big gym with only men for meningioma, and when this big abnormally looking goblin breaks through that wall, all the men in there get scared and start doing some weird Samoan war dance, which I then associate with the Samoma bodies typically found in meningiomas, and on and on and on. You can keep going with the story, keep adding diseases, keep adding information to your mental picture, that story that you made. You can even link another big table of neurological cancers for children, for example, and link them together using the story. That way you've now memorized two big tables together. Visualizing vividly means that you are creating an endless way to organize the information in your head. And to be honest, it all sounds a lot harder than it actually is. So practically, this is how I want you to apply the technique. 1. Create visual markers one by one for each of the information pieces that you are memorizing. 2. Outline the story in extreme levels of detail, going through things in a sequential order, continuously chunking the similar information or the things that are related to each other together. And number 3, write the story or do some rough drawings of the story in your notebook. If you actively use this method a lot, and especially if you have a lot of things to memorize in your degree, then you're gonna have a lot of short stories holding a lot of dense information, which is an amazing thing that our minds can do, but actually leaving that much to your memory is quite risky. So a good solution that a doctor recommended recently was to actually have a memory book of all the visualizations, the creative stories that we create, all the mnemonics that we use in med school. A memory book of all the things that we can't just leave to understanding. And it makes sense, if we're doing this visualizing this much, then why leave it to chance? Why not be organized about it? So spend like 10 minutes of your session where you actually do this, drawing out the doodles or the mental story that you went through for that table, for that huge table, by the way, that you're summarizing in this small little drawing, or for that rare disease that you didn't know about. So we can at least look back to the stories that we created if we forget them. Again, I'm repeating this. Understanding the information, the topic, is the hack do not do this uselessly. Visualizing and creating these stories is very active and helpful, but nothing beats just logically, intuitively, naturally understanding the medicine and the processes. Step 2, the modified memory palace. The second part of taking this visualizing technique to the next level is involving the method of loci or memory palaces, which by the way is a memory of a real place or location that you remember really well, like your school or old home. And the simple technique that most of these books talk about is to leave different objects in different locations within your big memory palace, so that when you do need to remember that list, you can just walk through your memory palace and remember those objects. And it's a very smart use of the spatial awareness in our brain, but I never really used this technique in the past because it wasn't going to help me with all the content that I needed to study for actual med school. I don't need to memorize this list of objects. The content is a lot more complicated than that. However, after reading through all these books and looking at the research of the best memory scientists, I've kind of created a really effective way to nuance this ingenious method for my own studies. And the way, to be honest, that anyone can do this is by first doing that step where you're creating all these stories, visualizations, mnemonics for a big topic, and then second, you take all these big stories and store them in that memory castle of yours. And I know it sounds complicated, like how are you expecting me to store these full stories with a lot of dense content in themselves in multiple locations within one room of one house? And to be honest, initially it is a big thing to wrap your head around. But there is a logical, smart way to do it, and at the end of it, you will not only just remember all the amount of content that you stored in that one short visual story, but you'll also be able to create multiple short stories to do with one topic and then store it all in that one room for that topic. And then you have multiple topics in that same location, that same house. Now for the practical technique, this is obviously going to be after you've created those good visual stories of yours to do with the tables, the difficult information in them, the rare diseases that you can't possibly remember, the long processes. Once you have these stories in your head, at least one or two of them, now you can start to actually place them in your memory castle. And for that, you need to, number one, create a path through your location where you're going to place your stories, your mnemonics, etc. This means planning and sketching it out on paper. You need to draw the location out on paper, all the big furniture inside each of the rooms. It'll take less than 15 minutes and you need to test your memory of how well you remember the location anyway. So draw a quick outline of the location on a piece of paper. Think about all the rooms, all the furniture within those rooms. Those furniture pieces or very prominent aspects will be used as micro stations for you to then place your visual stories on top of. The second step here is to now picture placing those visual stories one by one in those micro locations. And what's smart is if you clump all of these similar stories to do with the same topic in the same room. So micro stations, one story on the chair, one chair, and one story on the bed, one on the mirror, and that'll just allow you to remember that all of these different stories to do with the same topic are in the same room or macro station. I hope this is all making sense so far. There's probably text somewhere explaining the process as I speak about it. Rewatch this last bit if you don't understand. So for example, for microbiology, which is a huge topic in medicine that is mainly based on rote memorization, have a couple rooms or macro stations for gram-positive bacteria, have a couple rooms or entire floor or whatever for gram-negative bacteria, have a different house for fungi, have a different house for viruses. My point is, plan everything as well as possible before you start to do this stuff. Don't clump everything together in the same room or the same house. The technique is to actually space out the markers for the stories or mnemonics or whatever as much as possible in the room. Space out the rooms as well. It makes it easier to remember. And also it's very challenging to do all of this as you make up the stories and just start storing them in places. Plan it out as much as possible. Creating the stories is actually the easy, fun part, but actually thinking about the location, actually that's why I said sketch the locations up, because you need to think about where exactly each story is going to go, and that is the thing that will actually help you remember it. And it's honestly insane. You're doing a little bit of work to then just locate these stories, and as soon as when you need to re-jog your memory, you think about the topic, you think about the room, you think about where in the room this particular concept you stored, and then you go into that and remember all this information. And after some practice, it'll honestly feel like you have some photographic memory. A cool thing I've also been doing is creating stories from those initial mind maps of the topic. And by creating stories about the different subtopics and the topics and the way they link together on that mind map, they've been sticking in my head for longer. Because once I create a full story for this whole topic, I can then picture it as a mind map or a big poster in a room of one of the locations I have. I could go into a lot more nuance here about this entire process, but just start creating the stories. Start creating multiple stories to do the same topics that hold information like tables, information like mnemonics, and place them in the rooms of your memory castle. The more you do it, the more you'll slowly start to develop your method as you go forward. The reality of using these memory techniques. Now, obviously, this is all quite advanced and a lot of you might not need to use it, so really don't. Stick to good study techniques. I talk about all of the good study techniques to understand information really well in my guide right here. Definitely do everything in the first part of this guide, associating the information. Incorporate the visualizing and thinking of some stories for difficult information, and maybe that memory castle bit may be overkill for you. My point is, be the judge for yourself. For courses like medicine, law, info dense subjects, I can see these memory techniques being so useful. It excites me. Literally, for me, I've only just started creating these stories and using memory palaces. I've only just started to actually do enough of this to now get a hang of it. I've just started to draw a few sketches. But the thing is, I can already see the impact they've had on my ability to remember things. Random times a professor or a doctor has asked me something and I can now jump to my respiratory building. I can go into the restrictive disease corridor, get to the place for sarcoidosis, which I represent with a story of a young African-American female playing football, soccer reminding me of sarcoidosis, and that specific stereotype is because sarcoidosis is common in those people, and of course she loves her cardio health, so she never smokes because sarcoidosis is not typically found in smokers, it's found more in non-smokers. Her teammate is also there on the pitch using a squirty bottle to drink water, and that is to remind me of the BAL technique to use using bronchoscopies where I think they squirt water into the lungs and then collect that for examination. And the story goes on and on, obviously, but through this quick thinking of the story, I've now recalled all the facts to do with sarcoidosis, which would have usually taken me ages. So it's a disease I don't know much about. I think this specific story was heavily influenced by a sketchy video I was watching for USMLE, but again, my own thought process and my own way of remembering it. However, overall, even though it's been really helpful in the way I'm studying, doing these added memory techniques and adding them to my revision has added that extra level of processing in my head and to extra work to do on paper as well, which has kind of been taking extra time to get through the topics. And initially that was worrying me because of course I was spending too long on these topics, but the thing that is important to remember is that we are only doing this for the information that is difficult to 100% understand and then remember in your head. I'm basically doing it for conditions I haven't seen in real life, the rare diseases. I'm doing it for organisms and the details of specific cancers and things like that. And because I'm doing it this way, I am spending a lot more time in those study sessions, but I'm doing a lot fewer of those repetitions to remember that knowledge. The main benefit is that it's not rote memorization anymore. And to be honest, finding and developing these complex memory techniques into something simple that I can use for my own education was the entire reason that I actually wanted to make this video and do the research for this video. It was because I started to realize that I was now just rote memorizing the hard niche details, whereas creating stories, creating visual mnemonics, and then storing them in different locations, for example, my locations are mainly in med school and in schools, it's all been a very nice, natural way to remember the information for much, much longer. Like, I'm not even joking, a little bit of triggering, a little bit of cueing, and it's ingrained in my head. I can jump to the stories immediately and fish out the information. Part 3, recalling the information. But that being said, creating these stories and just storing them in places isn't going to be enough. The third big part of this memorizing guide is actually recalling the information, but doing it cleverly. And I'm not only going to summarize how I do this for the rest of my studies, but I will also give you a method for how I do this involving these memorization techniques. Before I get into this, there's a reason these memory techniques feel like magic. And it comes down to the 3 R's of remembering: record, retain, and retrieve. We initially substituted a word or a phrase for an image we're trying to record. This way we're using this image to encode what we need to remember. Us linking all these images and creating graphic characters and stuff out of them and linking them in a story is us retaining. And at the end of the day, thinking through these visual stories, looking through the memory palaces is the best form of retrieving. Well, I don't know if it's the best, but actually going through these stories and automatically just remembering things that you need to know, that way of retrieval is just much easier and more fun compared to actively trying to recall information. And retrieving information like this is much easier because of all of the cues and connections we created compared to us going in and trying to actively recall the information in the normal way. But anyways, for the practical aspects of this recalling step, this is what I've been doing. Step 1, initial mind map retrieval. Before starting to revise a big topic, I've now started to do 2 things. First, I sit there for 10 minutes and try to recall my entire skeletal map of the topic. Then the second thing I do is do like 15 practice questions, which I've mentioned before in my previous full study guide, and I've talked about why pre-testing is important, but let me expand on the first thing. how and why I recall the whole mind map. This is the mind map that I created initially during that mapping skimming section where I chunk the big topics together, make connections and associations, and link them all together and really deeply try to understand the basics of the topic. Which, by the way, regardless of whether I did this or not, fuels the rest of my learning. But let's start with how I actually remember these mind maps. And the way I do it is I link the individual topics and subtopics on the mind map and just create a short story of the whole thing. This short story is then stored in the room that is to do with this topic as a poster on the wall or something of that nature in my memory castle. And the reason I try and recall this mind map from memory in the first place is A, it rejogs the entire structure of the topic that I initially used to think about and the way I learned it in the first place. And B, this is the second time I'm going through and reading about this topic, so I should be able to recall this mind map better and actually add things to it, improve the structure of it as well. Either way, I'm using my time to actively think about the topic, to think about the structure, the basics, to really understand it before even starting. I've seen that doing the small practice before my study sessions really enhances the amount I end up remembering. It increases how fast my brain works in the study session, how quickly I can remember what I learned, and then it also increases how quickly I can see where my knowledge gaps are and fill them up. Simply because this mind map is all in front of me on a poster in a room of one of my memory castles, and I can see exactly where I need to fill in the blanks. And I know this kind of sounds like photographic memory, which trust me, I don't have, but it's just that these story techniques and memory castles make retrieving information that is in some part of your mind so easy. And to be honest, all you really need is a little bit of a practice round with doing this. That's why I suggested you doing this with your own topic, because to be honest, even I don't have that much practice. I've just been doing this for a few weeks. I'm still learning as well. Step 2, retrieving stories during the recall questions. Overall, the primary way I revise is I go through and answer my recall questions about a certain topic that I made the first time when I went through it. As I probably mentioned in around 80% of my videos, is that I convert all the information that I study into recall questions the first time I go through the topic, and then the next time I go through the topic, I actually sit down and test myself on these questions. And yeah, for most of my studying, I don't usually create huge visual stories and memory castles and things like that, but for the topics that I actually do need to do that for and memorize, I try and 1, add a few questions specifically to do with the visual stories that I've thought of. For example, in a question about the histopathology of sarcoidosis, I'd add a bracket saying, think about the soccer balls in a cage, which would then immediately cue me to think about these well-inflated, tightly packed balls in these cages, which is how the sarcoid granulomas are kind of placed together, and then that would trigger me to the rest of the cells in there, and on and on and on. Obviously, having this bracket is kind of a big hint when you're trying to answer these recall questions, trying to rack your brain and force your brain to recall. But initially, I think it's quite useful because it's quite hard to change the way that we retrieve information. And adding that bracket in there reminds me and hits that cue of, oh, I do have a story about this, and this is what it was, and this and this and this. The second thing I do while I try and answer these recall questions is to think specifically about the answer in a way that it takes me back to the visual story within the memory castle that I created. Because when I read a question, I automatically start getting reminded of the visual stories I created. I then dive into the location, the specific room, the specific place in that room. I'm going through the story one by one in chronological order and eventually getting to my answer. But as you can see, I've also now, through this process, run through the entire structure of the topic. I've looked at the location, the topic, the room, the specific space. I've ran through some of the series of events within this story, which has reminded me of the other bits of information that are related to this. If the question is about meningiomas, I'm thinking, oh yeah, that only men's gym that the wall got broken down into, the men were doing the Samoan dance. Yes, I remember that they have the meningiomas and the Samoan bodies of the meningiomas, but I'm also remembering the glioblastoma, the goblin that broke the wall down, and I'm also thinking through the fact that the glioblastomas across halfway through the CT, that there's a butterfly, that's how they're typically shaped. I'm running through all the surrounding information in my head. Like, just going through and having these stories in my head means I'm thinking about the rest of the associated information in a very quick, efficient way as well. I'm not just answering one specific question for one specific piece of knowledge that I made. I'm going through all the surrounding associated information as well, getting context and reviewing all of it in a very nice, fun, efficient way, which is a humongous benefit when doing these sessions and trying to retrieve. You not only do it better, but you also do it faster. You're literally able to retrieve entire classes of disease and huge tables with complex information with a few simple stories. Honestly, it still surprises me how cool it is once you put a little bit of effort into it. Step 3, spacing that retrieval. Now that you have all the information stored as specific stories within the memory castle, and you've also practiced recalling it, the way I'd suggest that you space your recall sessions out is how I typically recommend you space it all out. This is the formula that I use generally that works for me. For the easier topics, I only tend to review them maybe once or twice, recall them on day 1 and then day 4 to 5. And for the harder topics, I tend to do it around 2 or 3 times. I recall it on day 1, day 4, day 14 to 15, and that's about it. Spacing out this retrieval of the memorized information is extremely important. If you know the information, you know the story well, if you have the time before your exams, then obviously add more spaced repetitions. But the benefit of all the steps of this guide and all the study techniques and efficient ways of learning that I mentioned on this channel is that they really focus on maximizing the first initial study session, every single study session that comes afterwards, so that you're maximizing the amount of information you retain, so that at the end of it, you just have to study less and do less repetitions. I always try and focus on creating those layers of information, connecting everything together in each session, so that I don't have to then practice everything like 6 times afterwards. It's just too much. So that I can go through the information, create my questions, retrieve it 1 or 2 times, maybe 3 times maximum, and then know 80 to 90% of it front to back. Of course, add more study sessions for each topic that you need, but I would really suggest just trying to optimize the individual studying of the topics. That's the entire reason why I make videos like these, why I made this guide even, so that we can learn to study and then memorize the information that we need to do in a handful of times, rather than spending ages doing every single topic, doing this endless amounts of times for endless amounts of information. Anyways, that was the entire memorizing guide, where we first went through associating the information in our head, creating relevance and creating value through natural intuitive intrigue. Then we focused on how to visualize the information, which focused on combining all these complex memory techniques that everyone talks about, that all these big authors have researched for ages about, and then creating a simple method for ourselves to implement to create visual stories, to store them in our mental mind maps and palaces. Then we focused on how to visualize the information, which combined all these complex memory techniques that all these big authors talk about into one simple method that any student can use to memorize information of all kind. And lastly, we talked about how to recall all this information, how to recall these visual stories, all this complex, dense information stored in these stories, in these memory palaces of ours, and how to actually space out this recall as well. I really hope that most of it made sense to you, and at the minimum that you've taken some ways to improve your memorization skills. I'd really love some feedback on the guide. Please let me know down in the comments. Let me know what I should make the next guide about. Check out the link in the description for short form. Again, shortform.com/Zain. Click on it, get the 5-day free trial, and then you get 20% off the annual subscription as well. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like, spam the comments, help me out with the algorithm, and I will see you in the next one.